For 100 years after the collapse of Akkad, Mesopotamia reverted to its primal state of political anarchy. Then, in the late 22nd century BC, an imperial dynasty briefly rose to power in Sumeria itself. It called itself the Kingdom of Sumer and Akkad, but because of its place in the Sumerian king list, we call it Third Dynasty Ur, or Ur-III. The sources for Ur-III are more abundant than for any other period in Mesopotamian history. Hundreds of thousands of cuneiform texts have been found that date to the Third Dynasty. In fact, these texts represent more than half of all surviving cuneiform texts from the Near East. No other era in the history of the ancient Near East, or even Greece and Rome, offers such an incredible abundance of documentary evidence. The texts give us microscopic insights into the details of administration in Ur-III's empire. They document the inner workings of the state-run economy. They show us how intricate the state-run irrigation system was and the immense amount of manpower needed to maintain it. But there are still gaps, things the texts don't do. They don't give us much insight into private life. For example, we know that privately owned property existed, but only a handful of these hundreds of thousands of texts talk about privately owned crafts and industries. The texts also don't provide us with accounts of events. They contain almost no narrative information about Ur-III's history. That means we have to reconstruct Ur-III's history from other sources. Primarily, their practice of naming years, a practice they derive from the Akkadians. Most Third Dynasty year names deal with mundane things, like royal building projects, but enough of them talk about other activities that we can at least establish when events like wars took place, and sometimes add the occasional flash of color and a detail. For example, one of the year names tells us that Ur-Nammu was killed in battle. Another one says that at the end of Ur-III, Ibbi-Sin was captured by the Elamites and taken off to Elam. But most of the names are less dramatic. We have to content ourselves with vague references to campaigns against hill tribes in the Zagros and nomadic herdsmen in the desert fringe, or bald notices about the construction of walls to hold Ur-III's enemies at bay. So, lacking the sort of vivid narratives that we have for Greece and Rome, it's a real challenge to make the story of Third Dynasty Ur come alive. We have the outline, but we don't have the details. We have the skeleton, but we don't have the flesh, the blood, and the spirit. Even the origins of the dynasty and how it came to power are obscure. It appears that the foundations of Ur's control over Lower Mesopotamia were actually laid by a king of Uruk named Utu-Hegel. The story is that he fomented a general uprising against the hated Gutians, the barbarian interlopers from the Zagros who had helped deliver the coup de grace to Akkad. Utu-Hegel drove the Gutians out of Sumeria, but then drowned, touring an agricultural project, when a canal bank collapsed underneath him and pitched him into the water. Evidently, he was a non-swimmer. The account of Utu-Hegel's death is an odd sort of story. It seems like a very ordinary way to die for a ruler who just liberated the Sumerians from barbarian tyranny, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. In an era when legend often colors accounts of events, that gives this story a sort of fresh ring of authenticity. Authentic or not, according to the king list, the accident happened in 2112, in the 7th year of Utu-Hegel's reign. Supposedly, the founder of Third Dynasty Ur came to power immediately after Utu-Hegel's tragic demise. His name was Ur-Nammu. While Utu-Hegel was a liberator, Ur-Nammu was a conqueror. Just how Ur-Nammu came to power isn't so clear. It's been suggested that he was Utu-Hegel's brother, but according to another story, Utu-Hegel had appointed him Ensi of Ur. So some scholars think that Ur-Nammu may have begun his rise to power by rebelling against Utu-Hegel. Tempting to think that he'd been doing a little canal bank modification just before Utu-Hegel came on his inspection tour. Once on the throne, Ur-Nammu moved to establish control over Sumeria, but he didn't manage to do so without difficulty. The Ensi of Lagash rose up to challenge him. But Ur-Nammu responded decisively, swiftly, and crushed the upstart. That settled the issue. No one else renewed the challenge. He proclaimed his victory by taking the title king of Sumer and Akkad, in 2108, the fourth year of his reign. His control of Sumeria now secure, Ur-Nammu turned north, finishing off the hated Gutians. Next, he evicted the Elamites, who had taken over the northeastern part of the territory of Akkad. Then, in 2095, at the very peak of his conquest, he was killed in battle, fighting against unstated enemies and perhaps losing, since in the words of one account, he was, quote, abandoned in the battlefield like a crushed vessel, end quote. Ur-Nammu was followed on the throne by his son Shulgi, who reigned for 48 years, until 2047. On the whole, it was a peaceful time. The only military campaigning Shulgi seems to have done was in Assyria and along the eastern frontier in the Zagros foothills in southwestern Iran. He seems to have preferred diplomacy to war. He made a point of keeping good relations with the major commercial centers along the routes to the Mediterranean like Mari, Ebla, and Byblos, and in return, they sent him sacrificial animals for Ur's temples as tokens of their friendship. Ur-III's empire was more compact than Akkad's. It was focused on central and southern Mesopotamia and southwestern Iran. It was Shulgi who was the architect of Ur-III's governmental and administrative structure. The heart of what he created was history's first centrally planned and state-run economy. All the temple and city economies were welded by Shulgi into a single imperial system. The irrigation system of southern and central Mesopotamia was put under direct royal control. The government took over and directly operated key industries, the most important of which were the woolen and linen mills. International trade was placed under state officials called tamkars. Livestock raising was government controlled. Animals were raised and kept for temple use as sacrificial victims. Even labor resources were organized and allocated by the central government. The government could and did conscript workers not only for use on public projects like irrigation canals and the building of temples, but also for use in production facilities. Male workers controlled by the government were called gurush, or lads. Female workers were known as ngeme, or slave girls. Workers were regimented into teams of fishers, farmers, shepherds, and porters. Artisans and craftsmen were organized into workshops, sometimes with 100 or more people in them. All told, the government of Ur-III controlled the labor of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million men and women. Each male worker received a standard government ration of about 2.5 pints of barley per day. Each female received half that. Government workers also received a small quantity of vegetable oil and a little wool. Skilled craftsmen, administrators, and soldiers were also paid in rations, though more generous ones than those of the gurush and ngeme. Conscript laborers worked from sunrise to sunset with no days off, except for women during their periods when they were regarded as ritually impure. The government could arbitrarily transfer labor teams or their individual members to other types of work, or even to other parts of the empire. This means the system basically was one of state slavery. Like all such systems, Ur-III's system of state labor was very wasteful. With government rations being so small, attrition rates were very high. Female workers had to feed and support their children from their own rations, so child mortality must have been especially high. This means that the labor pool had to be replenished constantly through capture. Foreign captives were collected at Ur and distributed to projects from there. While they awaited processing and assignment, captives, especially women and children, were kept in something like concentration camps, often for long periods of time. Needless to say, many of them didn't survive. Exercising such intricate and microscopic control over the resources of an entire society spread across several hundred miles of thickly populated territory required an elaborate bureaucracy. The Ur-III bureaucracy was staffed by highly trained scribes, given the uniformity of language and writing style which they exhibit, and the government's obsession with controlling all other facets of productive activity. These scribes must have been the product of an education system that was every bit as centralized as the rest of Ur-3. Accountability was strictly enforced in bureaucracy, so everything was put in writing. Even simple transactions had to be copiously documented, with seals attached by each individual taking part, and then certified and sealed again by state financial controllers, higher and higher up the chain of authority. Like Akkad, Third Dynasty Ur crafted a royal ideology to mold the image of the king and to cement loyalty to his rule. Given the tenor of the Third Dynasty, it's no surprise that this royal ideology was all-encompassing. Much of our information about it comes from the so-called royal hymns, which stress the legitimacy of the king through his royal descent and dwell at length on his extraordinary qualities. The hymns show that Ur-3 strongly emphasized the divine aspect of kingship. The king was divinely born and appointed by the highest gods. This doesn't mean that Third Dynasty kings actually claimed to be gods. Naram Sin's proclamation of self-divinity appears to have left a nasty and lingering taste in Sumerian mouths. No, rather than being gods themselves, Third Dynasty rulers apparently preferred to bask in the light of divine descent, maybe thinking of their hero Gilgamesh, whose epic revolves around the fact that though he was two-thirds divine and had great power, he himself remained mortal. As in the royal ideology of Akkad, the royal hymns of Ur-3 portray the king as the ideal soldier and perfect military commander. He's exceptionally strong and brave. No one excels him in handling all kinds of weapons. In every battle, he personally leads his troops into combat. The fame of his triumphs is spread across the world. It fills his enemies with terror. The king is also a superb and fearless hunter of dangerous animals. Rather than striking the beasts from ambush or trapping them with nets, he fights them face to face, and by slaying them, he makes the land safe for the shepherds and their flocks. Besides his superlative qualities as defender of the realm and protector of its people, the king is also scrupulous in caring for the temples and in nurturing the prosperity of the land. And he's supremely fair in rendering judgment, a peerless protector of the weak and the vulnerable. These qualities are trumpeted in the prologue to the so-called Code of Ur-Nammu, the very first law code in all of history. The royal ideology even boasts of the king's intellectual superiority. The hymns stress his wisdom and learning. He's so wise that all seek his advice in the assembly. When he decides a case, he's able to speak all 5 of the languages spoken by his subject so fluently that he doesn't even have to use an interpreter. Furthermore, he's an expert diviner. He knows the liver-omen text better than anyone else. So when he examines the livers of sacrificial sheep, even the omen experts gasp in amazement at his skill. He's supremely well educated. He's studied both the scribal arts and mathematics, and he excels at all of them. He's a musician without peer. He knows all the hymns by heart. He has a pure and sweet voice, and he can tune and play every instrument. And when he makes music, the sound is so sweet that it delights not only his subjects, but even the gods. And his reverence for the gods is beyond compare. It's he alone who understands how to pray to them on behalf of his subjects, and he alone who knows their needs and can satisfy them. The king's subjects love and respect him, as later generations ought to also, and the kingdom is united and harmonious with him as the focus of that unity, its one supreme ruler. Third Dynasty kings also tried to cement loyalty to their rule by aggressively promoting Sumerian culture and identity. They worked particularly hard to forge close political and cultural links between Ur and the city of Uruk, which had been the launching pad for Ur-Nammu's rise to power, counterfeiting genealogies for themselves that linked them with legendary figures in Uruk's mythical past. They even claimed Gilgamesh's mythical parents Ninsun and Lugalbanda as their ancestors. Central to this program of cultural nationalism was the Third Dynasty's sponsorship of literary activity in the Sumerian language, an effort which was so successful that the period is now called the Sumerian Renaissance. It was under Ur-3 that epics like Gilgamesh were given their classic Sumerian form. Perhaps, in a slap at the memory of Sargon and Naram-Sin, the use of Akkadian was abandoned in administrative texts, and virtually all such texts from the Third Dynasty were written once more in Sumerian. The centralization that characterized Ur-III's economy was paralleled by an equal centralization of its administration. Third Dynasty Ur created the first truly imperial system of administration, subdividing the empire into administrative units directly subordinated to the central government. The empire was marked off into two major zones, the imperial heartland of Sumer and Akkad, and a military zone to the east between the Tigris and the Zagros Mountains. Like the rest of Ur-III's centralization program, this system was developed by Shulgi. It appears to date to after the 20th year of his reign, when he launched his conquest of southwestern Iran and Elam, which would have given him the impetus to restructure the government of the Mesopotamian heartland. The system wasn't created in a single stroke, and he seems to have continued to tinker with it until his death. The first zone, the heartland, comprised central and southern Mesopotamia, including the Diyala Valley, and was divided into something like 20 provinces. Basically, these were the territories of the formerly independent city-states, which now served as the provinces' capitals. Provinces were ruled by governors with the familiar title of ensi. Ensis were often appointed from prominent local families, and sons could inherit the position from their fathers. Other family members often occupied high positions in the provincial administration below them. It seems likely that the Ur-III kings did this in the hope of winning the loyalty of the local elites. They also took wives from important local families for the same purpose. Shulgi himself had no fewer than 9 provincial wives. The duties of the ensis can be figured out by carefully examining the cuneiform archives. We can see that the ensis had extensive powers, basically functioning as the king's deputies. They oversaw the judicial system in their provinces and acted as the supreme judges. They were responsible for maintaining the canal system, which was crucial to agricultural productivity and the food supply. They also controlled the temple estates, which in Sumeria were very large. Since the temple estates generated a lot of income, this meant that the ensis effectively controlled provincial revenues as well. Shulgi established a military administration in the Heartland region separate from the civil administration. This military administration was headed by generals called shugina in Sumerian. Military zones of authority didn't always coincide with the provinces of the civil administration. The province of Umma, for example, had one ensi, but several shugina, each with his own separate district. Generals were not drawn from the local elites of the districts they commanded, nor were they members of prominent old families. They were chosen by the king from groups of men who had made their careers in royal service loyal to him. Many were Akkadians or foreigners, including Hurrians, Elamites, and even Amorites. This made them completely dependent on the king. Strengthening this dependence is the fact that they were often married to women of the royal family and depended for their livelihood on income from royal agricultural estates and other properties. The division between military and civil authority reduced the ability of both the ensis and the shugina to turn against the throne. By keeping military command separate from civil authority, Shulgi kept the ensis away from the troops, and by keeping authority over revenue separate from military command, he made it more difficult for the shugina to bribe their men to rebel. Shulgi created a strongly centralized system of taxation that extracted a significant part of the Heartland province's resources. In essence, the system was a massive fund to which all provinces had to contribute goods and from which they could withdraw supplies, enabling the state to use resources from all over its territory. He gave it the Sumerian name Bela, which means exchange. The amount and composition of each province's contributions depended on the economic potential of the province and the nature of its productive sector. For example, the province of Girsu provided grain, which it grew in abundance, while its neighbor Umma, noted for its crafts production, contributed manufactured goods in leather, wood, and reeds. Many of the taxes paid by a province went to support the royal functionaries and laborers stationed within its territory. But some were sent to special collection points from which they were distributed when and where they were needed. Each province's contribution was calculated in advance based on its agricultural and manufacturing potential. In the case of grain crops, for example, officials measured the size of the agricultural area and estimated the potential harvest. At the end of the year, actual collections were compared to projected ones, and a balance, positive or negative, would be carried over into the subsequent year. Provinces were able to draw on the fund to meet their needs, thus making the resources of the entire empire available to all. Of course, accountants meticulously tallied everything that came in and went out. In the second zone, the frontier lands on the empire's eastern periphery, Shulgi imposed direct military government. Control of the frontier zone, on which the security of the state depended, lay in the hands of an official called the Sukulma. He appears to have functioned as a sort of viceroy, and in fact later kings of Elam took the title for themselves. In the eastern frontier lands, the Shigina were subordinate to the Sukulma. The generals could be transferred at will by the king from one center to another. The Sukulma tasked the Shigina with collecting tribute, which usually in the military zone took the form of livestock. This was levied in precisely specified numbers of sheep, goats, and cattle, which were to be procured by different levels of the military establishment. How the troops gathered these animals, we don't know, but in all likelihood they got them either peacefully or by extortion from the local population. These tribute animals were then gathered in a central facility called Puzrish Dagan, built by Shulgi in the 38th year of his reign. At Puzrish Dagan, they entered the Bela system and then could be issued by the court for temple offerings or for food. In Bronze Age terms, the numbers of livestock involved were immense. Up to 200 sheep and goats and 15 cattle could pass through Puzrish Dagan in a single day. To facilitate the movement of troops and goods, the kings of Ur-III built a network of roads that ran throughout their empire. These appear to have been equipped with a service infrastructure. The royal hymns mention rest houses and talk about making travel both fast and safe. So in all likelihood, there was a regular system of surveillance and garrison security posts too. But after barely a century of existence, the empire of Ur-III suddenly disintegrated. The underlying cause of the empire's collapse was undoubtedly its dependence on central planning. Shulgi had created a dangerously intricate system. It depended on a lot of preconditions, all of them functioning smoothly. Holding together a large swath of territory, maintaining smooth and regular communications, the uninterrupted collection of taxes and forwarding of tribute, the secure protection of long frontiers, and the regular and undisturbed production of wealth in the form of finished goods and agricultural surpluses. If the delicate balance of Shulgi's system were upset by anything, human or natural, the system could easily begin to collapse, and once it began to collapse, not be able to recover its stability. Since he was the first ruler ever to create such a tightly centralized system of government economic control, it's likely Shulgi didn't even realize how fragile his system was. The immediate cause of the empire's collapse was a nomadic invasion which upset the delicate balance of the centrally planned state economy. Hints of trouble began to appear in the reign of Shur-Sin between 2037 and 2029. He's rapidly boiled into a crisis in the reign of his successor, Ibbi-Sin, who ruled until 2004. The exact sequence of events is a little fuzzy. It looks as though the nomadic Amorites played a central role in the disintegration of Ur-III's empire. Amorites is a generic term the Third Dynasty texts use for the clans of herdsmen who tended their flocks in the arid grasslands along the southern fringe of the Fertile Crescent. These pastoral tribes seem to have suffered from severe drought in the sheep-trampled steppes of Syria, began to cross the Euphrates in search of pasturage in the rich agricultural fields along the river. In an effort to stop the Amorites, Ur-III built a defensive wall along the edge of the so-called Gypsum Desert between the Tigris and Euphrates. But rather than try to cross the wall, the Amorites simply slipped around its western end and crossed into Upper Mesopotamia from that direction. Ibbi-Sin appears to have underestimated the Amorite threat. At the time of their invasion, he was in Elam, putting down one of its periodic rebellions. The Amorites drove their flocks into the Sumerian grain fields, flowed like human floodwaters across the land, and blocked the roads along which supplies traveled between the cities. The fragile Ur-3 system rapidly began to unravel. When the Crown couldn't respond swiftly to their pleas for help, the local NCs took matters in their own hands and declared their independence. With central control weakening, the Gurush labor teams saw their opportunity and scattered. A lot of them went one better and joined the Amorites in looting state property to feed themselves. When he got back from Elam, Ibbi-Sin faced an incipient famine thanks to the collapse of the Bela system. People in the huge state economy relied on state-provided rations, but half the districts had now stopped providing supplies. Ibbi-Sin sent an envoy, Ishbi-Era, to the intact western regions of the empire to procure rations, but all this did was lead to another rebellion. In a letter to Ibbi-Sin, Ishbi-Era informs the king that he's bought grain in Isen, not far from Nippur, but then Ibbi-Sin was unable to provide boats to transport the rations. Ishbi-Era saw his chance and seceded from Ur, proclaiming himself king. First he was cautious and only took the title, king of his own country. But later he proclaimed himself king of Sumer and Akkad. The surviving NCs then went over to him and recognized him as king. Ibbi-Sin held out for a few more years in Ur, but the Elamites took advantage of Ur-3's weakness and attacked Sumeria, besieging Ur, starving it into submission. The demise of Ur was remembered in this lament, quote, "This hunger contorts the people's faces. It twists their muscles. The people are as if surrounded by water. They gasp for breath. The king breathed heavily in his palace, all alone. The people dropped their weapons. Their weapons hit the ground. They struck their necks with their hands and cried. They sought counsel with each other. They searched for answers. Alas, what can we say about it? What more can we add to it? How long until we are finished off by this calamity? Or, inside it there is death. Outside it there is death. Inside it we are being finished off by famine. Outside it we are being finished off by Elamite weapons. In Ur the enemy has oppressed us. Oh, we are finished." End quote. For a while the Elamites garrisoned the empty husk of the fallen and deserted city. But eventually they went home, and it stood abandoned. With the collapse of Ur-3, Mesopotamia lapsed back into its previous state, a patchwork of independent principalities. Several small kingdoms emerged in Upper Mesopotamia along the Tigris and the lower Diyala River Valley and along the road to Elam. Ruling in Isen from 2017 to 1985, Ibbi-Sin's former envoy, Ishbi-Era, was the leading king in Lower Mesopotamia. He tried to pretend that he was the successor to Ur-3's mantle, and as far as he could, tried to mimic Ur-3's royal style. The state language remained Sumerian, though few people spoke it anymore. The workshops staffed by the Gurush laborers remained, but the centralized agricultural system was unsustainable. Though they remained in theory state lands, the fields were redistributed to the peasants to work as if they were their own. The Amorites, who settled throughout much of Mesopotamia, didn't know how to keep up the complex irrigation systems, so the fields dried up, and soon it was impossible even to graze their sheep. By the middle of the 20th century BC, even Isen had abandoned the effort to resurrect the corpse of Ur-3, and Sumeria's one attempt at empire faded into memory. Empires may die, but the dream of empire lived on and moved north to an obscure town called Babylon.